Well, Danny, let me just say it is an honor to have you back on. Both myself and Eric are just extremely grateful that you decided to give us a second chance. We're not going to go into details before of what was allegedly said by individuals. All we want to say is that we think you're an upstanding individual, a pillar in the community, and we're happy to have you on this episode today to talk about chrononutrition, my man.
Yeah, and we knew you'd be taking the high road, and it's just the type of person we know you are, which we respect.
Yeah.
To be perfectly honest, a couple of things I will say before we start. I think first, all of the words that you've just offered probably ring quite hollow, and especially for anyone who's listened to your previous comments, many people have probably seen how that has negatively impacted myself, both reputation-wise, but also just psychologically over these past number of months. And it's quite clear that what you've just said is a mediocre attempt to dig yourself out of quite a rather large hole. And so the reason why I'm here today is just to say, to be quite honest, I don't want anything to do with your show. I think that you're both unprofessional and really actually quite inadequate at what you're trying to do. So you can go fuck yourselves.
Well, Danny, let me just say, man, if I could just, okay.
Yeah. I think he needs maybe a few minutes to cool off, but I think that went pretty well, all in all.
Honestly, I think he took the apology to heart, and I appreciate that. And honestly, Eric, we could just do the chrononutrition episode without him. Like, you know, meal timing.
Yeah, I've got a pyramid that's in there.
Yeah, dude, we'll just CGI him to like your left, and he'll be silent the whole time. It'll be great.
I think he'd appreciate that.
Yeah. No, he seemed pretty. He was appreciative of our effort, and that's what I took away from that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, I honestly, I think we can pat ourselves on the back. I think we dismissed the hosts, and we've boldly stepped forward, and I think Danny sees that.
And thus ends probably the most epic storyline arc on fitness podcast, the Danny Lennon serial killer arc. We are thrilled that you're back on, Danny. You know, there is another podcast, and we can already sense our season 2 arc, Eric, with Stronger by Scientology, I think they call themselves, where they claim to be the first ever fitness podcast. We're the first ever fitness podcast with the storyline. So there's some individuals that said, hey, you guys have played that joke into the ground about dismissing your old hosts. You'll be pleased to know that it's a genuine storyline here, what we did, and it ends today, and we bring it full circle by bringing the man, the myth, the legend, Danny on for a killer episode.
Yep, I feel the same way. I mean, the joke isn't played into the ground until we say the joke's over. Yeah. So, to anyone who said that, you're wrong.
Yeah,
and I feel strongly about that statement.
Yes, sir. And I would say the joke isn't played into the ground until someone's buried under the ground. So, like, really, when we talk about nutrition, I had Danny Lennon on the old YouTube channel, and you wrote a fantastic article on Stronger by Science, Chrononutrition, where you went into detail. I think it'd be fantastic because we have Sir Eric Helms, Dr. Eric Helms, PhD. I want to get that right. I don't want to, say anything that's not true. You went to school, you done learned some things. We could go even more granular on iron culture, talking about chrononutrition, and then having kind of a meta conversation, a philosophical tangent, talking about the evidence-based community and sometimes how we could shorten heuristics, things that we think would be useful, into platitudes. So it goes from being a useful, dirty, fast rule to try and communicate information to the masses into like, it doesn't matter, like it's an oversimplification. So we're just thrilled to have you genuinely on, Danny, back on the podcast.
Oh, thank you for having me. It's always good to talk about this stuff. Although when I first wrote some of these pieces and agreed to talk to people about it, I didn't really want to have to become and defend myself to someone with a PhD in nutrition. So I kind of feel a bit under pressure right now. So hopefully I can do an okay job.
Well, no worries. You're confusing me with Eric Trexler as a PhD in the nutrition-related field. My PhD is in a 1 to 10 scale. That's about the extensiveness of that. So I do have a master's in nutrition, but so do you. So clearly we're equivalent.
Yeah.
And we are certainly not equivalent in many ways.
Wow.
I see what you do. I think he's trying to compliment me. What he's actually saying is I've seen this man naked. you'd be surprised. Let's just put it that way.
Let's just say that I'm just real excited, and yes, maybe I get excited when I have two muscular gentlemen talking big brainy things. So it's like a sapiosexual plus a few other things. I'm not gonna lie, I was the one that brought up the idea for this episode, and Eric agreed, and he indulged me. So we just got a lot of masters here today to talk about chrononutrition. I will say, Danny, that when I read the comments by individuals that watched the video, they were overwhelmingly agreeable. But what's interesting, as Eric was saying off camera, we want to talk now about actually chrononutrition. How some individuals, when they hear that, they think, "Oh, people are just inventing new terminology now." Like, wait a second, like chrononutrition, the intersection between your biology, circadian rhythms, and nutrition. What? Like you're just trying to put a new spin on something old. It's like, well, let's get some definitions out of the way, because I actually really like how you frame things. And again, we talk about those heuristics that you outlined. Let's talk about chrononutrition. Can you give us just a brief overview of what it is and what are circadian rhythms and why they matter when it comes to nutrition?
Sure. So I'll do my best to kind of keep it brief, and we can dig into some specifics afterwards. But I also think it's really good point you make about how some people's initial comments might be a bit skeptical of it. And I'm super sympathetic towards that, because this sounds on the surface like an area that is prime for picking by pseudoscience and charlatans and saying, oh, there's all these rhythms that go on and you have to get this very precise timing. So hopefully throughout this we'll show that's not necessarily the case, but we also don't want to default to the other position of immediately dismissing something because it doesn't fit in with a very simplistic narrative. So quite simply, the term chrononutrition comes out of the area of chronobiology, which is a branch of biology looking at time-based phenomena and various different biological processes. So the main area within chronobiology that people may be familiar with is that we have various different cycles. We have light and dark cycles that influence our biology. We have impacts on circadian rhythms, which we'll come to in a moment, and various different hormones, for example, like melatonin, cortisol, leptin, insulin, all run on a biological rhythm, a circadian rhythm. So within chrononutrition, it's simply how does this interplay between when and what we eat impact these biological rhythms within the body? And then also in the other direction, how do these certain biological rhythms potentially have implications for when and what we eat? And we can give examples of each of those in the moment. But as a kind of an outset, that's typically what we're talking about, this area of chrononutrition. How does meal and nutrient timing have an impact on health via impacts on these internal biological processes that run on a certain rhythm? And we can talk more about different rhythms and cycles if you wish, but I think that's a good starting point, if I answered the question correctly.
Yeah, that's perfect. I think it's a great primer, and I think people can see that it is a subtly different field of study than nutrient timing, which is something that came pretty much just distinctly out of sports science and primarily started with endurance athletes looking to refuel for multi-stage events. And then, there was a whole response to that as it got kind of taken up by the bodybuilding community, who probably didn't have as much application. And then there's a whole other field of, protein timing that's all related to trying to achieve, the most area under the curve of muscle protein synthesis. So I think this is a great example, like you brought up, Omar, of where something kind of gets just stamped with probably a too broad of a brush. And as you can tell, I'm definitely an artist because I know the way brushes work. They stamp things. Some people think it's stamp things, but common misunderstanding. So yeah, it's just a great example of how there's a similarity but an intricate nuance here. We're specifically dealing with some of the systems in the body which do run on a clock type of pattern, and I think that's just really interesting, that the idea that we have these biological systems that have a time component.
Right. And I think that's a really good point, because there's probably other distinctions we'll get to later in this discussion, for example, on time-restricted feeding or time-restricted eating. And people say, oh, that's just what intermittent fasting is, or that's just the same as lean gains, right? And not understanding that we have this area of time-restricted feeding that was being born out of circadian research, really. And there's some slight differences between it, say, a daily intermittent fast or other fasting protocols. And the same thing here, that people can be quick to dismiss the idea of, oh, this meal timing or when we eat or how we distribute our energy may have an impact. They may dismiss that because, oh, we realized long ago that it doesn't matter about if you eat breakfast or not, or this idea if you eat after 6 p.m. you'll immediately gain loads of body fat is nonsense. And I completely agree. And this is where that I would say overcompensation for some of those claims has kicked in. And it's, for example, with the breakfast thing, it's quite clear that when you scrutinize it and look at the idea of when people would say, oh, you have to eat breakfast to get your metabolism going, right? Or you need to have like glucose in the morning because your brain runs on glucose. And if you don't eat a breakfast with carbs, you're going to have like brain fog or something. And we can say, well, that's not really necessarily true. And if someone doesn't have breakfast as soon as they wake, they don't have some of these negatives. Or the idea you must eat small meals frequently throughout the day to keep your metabolism up. It's like, well, that's not necessarily true either. Or eating carbohydrates after 6 p.m. magically means you're going to gain more body fat than if you didn't. And so we can push back against all those. But if you push back so far as if to say, well, none of this stuff matters, then you can leave people with this overly simplistic, misleading kind of bite-sized chunk of, hey, it doesn't matter when you eat as long as your daily macros are fine. And that might be actually a useful heuristic for some people, especially if it's body composition they were talking about, that if they're focusing on all other factors that are kind of irrelevant, bringing them back to saying, hey, look, focus on the stuff that's most important. And if you generally get your macronutrient intake right over the day, you can make progress towards whatever your body composition goal is. That's one specific phrase. That's different from just saying nothing matters as long as your macronutrients are the same across the day. And so we have to be a bit more precise in our language, I think. And I'm sure we'll probably discuss that later on, but I thought it was useful that you brought that particular point up.
Yeah, I will say that we joke, but myself and Eric were united in so many ways, but we're united in our fight against nihilism overall, the nothingness, where sometimes people can oversimplify, even from an academic standpoint, that Eric brought up in another episode, the concept where sometimes individuals can explain something for the wrong reason. So they have, the mechanism is wrong, but the idea behind it might be right. So the idea, I think Eric said about doing higher repetitions gets you more cut. It's like, well, it actually expends more calories overall. If you did 15 repetitions for 3 sets as opposed to 5 repetitions for 3 sets, you burn more calories. That doesn't mean that actually doing 15 reps is cutting on the inside like the upper inner pec, but it means you are burning more calories. And when you spoke in the article, what I really liked, and we'll get into it, about eating a breakfast and the behavioral changes of just increasing your NEAT overall. It seems like individuals that eat breakfast, they might tend to move around more. So it's not boosting your metabolism, it's just individuals from a behavior standpoint might move around. I think giving proper context is always important, and that's what's so cool about podcasts. And I'll give a legitimate shout out to Sigma Nutrition, who my brother Eric is someone that he listens to. He actually we knew of you from before when we did the carbohydrate episode, but he was like, hey man, like this Danny Lennon, some of the Sigma Nutrition, you could go into more detail with podcasts. That's what's really cool, because one of the things I've actually struggled with, quick tangent, and Eric, I'll let you share your thoughts about the Instagram model overall, is as a communicator, you're trying to distill as much information in the most digestible way. And so there's always kind of an opportunity cost. Well, if I go into more detail, I might lose individuals. People are only looking for 3 things or whatever to digest at any one period of time. What can I focus on? And so you go over these rules, and then it gets, once again, you slowly start rounding off some of those edges, and then what you're left with at the end is kind of a broken telephone situation, and that becomes the norm, and that becomes kind of the standardized accepted truth. And to even suggest that there's more nuance than that truth almost starts running counter to what the establishment is saying. It's just interesting.
Yeah. I totally agree, Omar. And it's something I think every content producer is trying to create change in the information that is accepted, or to hopefully build the critical thinking skills of their audience, has probably had some head scratching moments where they've been on Instagram, they tried to create like an infographic because it's the only way to deliver a lot of information, and realize that it's the most complex chart they've ever created and scrapped it. Or that they've, they're typing on their phone with their fingers for 20 minutes and they get to the word count stop and they go back and they start changing and to ampersands and they start making contractions and they're like, how can I fit this all? And just not realizing that there is a time and a place and a platform for long form content, short form content, and that if you don't get that right, sometimes you can be party to furthering these kind of cultural memes, and I do consider the evidence-based community a culture, unfortunately, that are not necessarily factually correct in all ways, but are heuristics that are bordering on falsehoods.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think I've talked a few times recently on the podcast about a similar concept and how I've said to a few other people of how sometimes it's almost becoming not useful to even use the term evidence-based because it's almost lost all meaning, and that just someone terming themselves evidence-based now virtually means nothing, because you could have the two examples I gave is you could end up, say if someone starts following Eric's content and then they start parroting a lot of the conclusions that he puts out, they could get to a place where they are saying all the same things that Eric would say, but they don't understand why he got to those conclusions. So that's why then they might get into a debate with someone who comes with completely false information, but they are not able to back up why they got to a certain conclusion. And so the only difference between them and someone who ended up getting unlucky and following some sort of nonsensical pseudoscience was just who they managed to find, right? And someone got lucky that they found Eric, someone else got unlucky and found someone else that was very convincing, but maybe talking nonsense. But how you ended up getting to your conclusions was the same route. You're just taking that information for granted. So that's where going deeper into some of the more long form content pays off, when you can understand why you get to a certain conclusion. And that's the problem I have sometimes with people who use evidence-based as a way to make them sound superior to other people, when really all I've done is the exact same process and just happen to parrot the conclusions of someone else. And I kind of think that fits into the same idea.
Yeah, that's really well said, Danny. So I think we'll return to this kind of philosophical meta discussion of how maybe we can avoid this pitfall specifically, but to address the specific topic at hand of chrononutrition, can you lay out some of the groundwork here? So someone who heard, circadian rhythm, I know there's a lot of people who have heard that term, but they may not actually know what it means. They think, oh yeah, it's related to like sleep, and it sucks when right. That's why jet lag happens, but that might be the extent of their understanding. So can you break that down for us and how it's impacted by other aspects of our life?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think going back to my previous point before I went on that weird tangent was that we have all these various biological processes that run on different rhythms. Now, they can vary in that time period for certain rhythms. So some are relatively short. So if you take within a block of sleep, we have various different sleep cycles. And people may have heard, a sleep cycle might be around 90 minutes, for example. And then on the other end, you could have another biological process like the menstrual cycle, which on average might run about 28 days, give or take a number of days. So you have one example here of that less than 24-hour cycle, like a sleep cycle, would be an ultradian rhythm. Then we have something like the menstrual cycle, which is more than 24 hours, is an infradian rhythm. And so just a circadian rhythm, as people are probably guessing now, is something that's about 24 hours in length. So the cycle, let's say for if we take the example of cortisol, starting high in the morning, going down throughout the day, there's a pattern to that over 24 hours that just keeps repeating every 24 hours. That's a circadian rhythm. Now, circadian rhythms are dictated by circadian clocks. And our main circadian clock is something called the suprachiasmatic nucleus, or the SCN. It's located up by the hypothalamus in the brain, and essentially just a bundle of like 20,000 or so neurons, these neuronal cells that make up what we call a circadian clock. Now, this master clock regulates all these circadian rhythms throughout the body, these various different hormones and processes and so on. Now, people have kind of probably heard that colloquially as well, right? When people talk about jet lag, for example, they say, my body clock is off. And this is true. You get these kind of phase shifts in these rhythms based on going across time zones. But so you do have this body clock being off, but we don't just have this one body clock, this one circadian clock. There's actually circadian clocks located in tissues all around the body. We call these peripheral circadian clocks. So now we have this main master clock in the brain, and then we have all these peripheral circadian clocks located around the body, which are also influenced by that master clock. Now, one thing to note is when we say something has a circadian rhythm, that means that that rhythm is intrinsic or endogenous to that process within the body, regardless of external stimuli. So, for example, what I mean is if I were to take you and put you in a completely pitch black room with no light in there, with no change in temperature, nothing else, not going to kill you or anything like that, but just to clarify,
we weren't
away.
For the record, we weren't thinking it.
See the way you were looking.
Yeah,
I could see the way you were looking.
No, we weren't thinking it, man.
That's previous host stuff.
Okay.
That's not us.
Okay,
Yeah.
totally cool. So I've locked you in this pitch black room with no way of escaping. Those rhythms within your body will stay running at about that 24-hour period. So even regardless of any external stimuli, they stay running about 24 hours. Now, I say about 24 hours because it's not precisely 24 hours. So it doesn't match up exactly to our solar day. So in order for there not to be a mismatch, we have to rely on external stimuli to entrain or refine or tweak that time period to a more precise 24 hours. Because otherwise, let's say in that case where they're just running at, and so it depends on what study you look at, but it seems on average, you could take the average human would have a circadian rhythm that runs at about 24 hours and 15 minutes if left to its own devices. So now if I have you in that pitch black room continuously, day after day, as each day goes by, there's kind of a more of a 15 minutes on top of 15 minutes mismatch each time, right? So you get further and further, and this is called circadian misalignment, and we can come back to that in a moment. So we essentially rely on stimuli within our environment to refine or help us keep in sync with the solar day. So our main entraining factor, or the stimulus that is most potent for setting these rhythms, is our exposure to light. So light comes into the eye, hits the retina, and the retina is actually attached to the SCN, or that master clock that I mentioned. So this signals, hey, there's light about. So we get an idea of when is day, and then when there's no light around, it's not day. And this is how we would have evolved to be able to keep in time with that solar day. So we have these external stimuli called zeitgebers that allow us to set those circadian clocks. Now, one of the interesting things we found, and where some of the nutrition stuff comes in, is that it's not just light and dark exposure that can influence these circadian clocks. There's also many other things, one of those being nutrient ingestion. But it seems that nutrient ingestion can help entrain those peripheral circadian clocks, but doesn't have the same entraining impact on that master clock. So therefore, we could say, oh, now there's actually a potential, depending on when we eat, for us to cause a misalignment or desynchronization between some of those peripheral clocks and that master clock. So that's one way where we're looking at this idea of chrononutrition being, can we match up our food intake to when it's best based on our circadian biology? And then the other kind of aspect I mentioned earlier is if we know that, let's say, instant sensitivity runs in a circadian rhythm, starts highest in the morning and then dips out throughout the day, that might have implications for saying, well, is there actually a better time to have a really high carbohydrate meal for this person? We can discuss maybe some of the clinical significance later, but we can at least say that it's not the exact same whether you have a really high carb meal in the morning versus if you have it really late at night. There's going to be metabolic differences in that we typically see a worse glucose excursion very late at night, particularly the further you go into biological night, you get a worse glucose excursion. So blood glucose goes higher and stays higher for longer over that next period than if you'd had that earlier in the day. And there are some caveats that I'm sure we'll come to later on. But there are some examples of how potentially when we eat can influence circadian clocks and therefore help create circadian alignment or misalignment, or on the other end, how these circadian rhythms can make it a better or worse time to make certain nutrient choices, or at least that's some of the reasoning that we talk about within chrononutrition. And then the final thing I'll say before we can get into any of the details that you want would be with chrononutrition, I've typically broken this into kind of 4 different distinct elements that we could look at. One would just be when you eat a meal, example being what I just said of if you eat a meal in the morning versus at night, is there a difference? The next would be how we distribute energy across the day. So even if the meal times stay the same, doesn't matter if we put the bulk of our calories earlier in the day versus later in the day versus evenly across the day. Then we could look at the consistency or regularity of our feeding times. So this is not regular meals in a day. It's more from day to day. Do your meal times change dramatically or do they stay relatively stable? And then the final would be the feeding and fasting window, similar to time restricted feeding. And we can discuss some of that. So there's these different elements that all would come under the umbrella of chrononutrition. And they're simply thinking about where we place those nutrients across the day and what impact does it have on circadian rhythms.
I think that's really interesting, Danny. And I think it helps. And I think if anyone really thinks about it, they understand, like, just when you start to explore the different things that just go on in your daily life, like, man, there's a ton of these cyclical, clock-like things that are going on in our bodies, from, digestion to sleep to the menstrual cycle, to when you feel tired, to when you feel like you have energy, to even the response to nutrients that are the same, but just given at different times, and how that relates to where you are, receiving light, etc. And it goes so deep in there in almost every system of the body. I remember I was participating in a study at AUT where we were specifically being cannulated and giving a blood glucose response for 5 hours. And I was sitting there with other researchers who had volunteered to be participants in this study, because that's something that happens at universities. Like, all these researchers understand the importance of research, and we ask each other to participate. So I get to do these weird multidisciplinary studies sometimes. And I'm sitting here discussing my research with a physiologist, and he's interested in why I'm having people rate their lifts on a 1 to 10 scale. And then I ask him what he does, and he's talking about how there are actually these nasal breathing rhythms when we sleep, that you predominantly breathe through one nostril or the other, and that's sometimes why you might flip over, and that at different stages of sleep and different times in the night, you breathe in different ways. And I had no idea. And it just made me think, not only is that interesting, but just the degree to the number of things that exist in each one of these systems in our bodies that we may or may not even encounter as nutrition and exercise science researchers is probably much more than we even know. And so anyway, there's plethora of these all over our body, which is kind of neat. Now, what I want to touch on next is to point out why some of the things you're going to talk about might be very similar, but have distinct recommendations from things like intermittent fasting, from the quote unquote like Martin Berkhan lean gains. And I think that's because of how they were generated. So some of the the fitness books and nutrition books that have come out over the years, or Martin Berkhan's lean gains, they came from a practitioner who is science aware, trying to create a system to help people nutritionally. So it's almost this convergence of what makes sense socially and in your social system, and what are the barriers to why you can't actually lose fat behaviorally, to then the intersection with science and what might make sense. And I think that's why you see things like, when people are most easily able to ignore food, that's the first part of the day. And when they typically overeat anyway, what if we allow that, facilitate it, but restrict it? And so there's elements of time restricted feeding and manipulating some of these chrononutrition principles, but they get to slightly different points. So I would love to hear, since you kind of dovetailed nicely to it, based on what we're starting to uncover, looking purely at the science, and then maybe coming out of that as ways to treat metabolic disease or help people be healthier, etc. What does it seem like might be the best way to align some of these rhythms in our body with nutrient intake? Where does the research lead us to? What would lead to the best metabolic health profile or something
Cool.
like that?
Yeah, I'll try to go through some of the things I think that, at least that to me, appear to show certain trends, and we need to be kind of careful in this area. And it's hopefully one of the things I was able to get across with some of the communication of this is it's super interesting, but I'm not disputing that there's still things that we need to work out. And that's why I think I typically refer to heuristics that people could follow, as opposed to here are clear guidelines that you need to follow. I really like the point you make about the distinct differences between something like a lean gains and maybe some of the timing we would discuss in a circadian sense. sense. And that's really important because it just goes back to our previous point of understanding where did this stuff come from and in what context. So if you're looking at something like lean gains, it doesn't say any of that is irrelevant because it's saying that was purely a nutritional intervention that someone has put together for someone aiming to change body composition primarily, whilst also being able to stick to the main principles of their overall calories, macronutrients, and be able to adhere to that plan. And that's what that does. So it's set up in a way with, particularly if the phase is to diet, which primarily a lot of people use that for, is a way to make calorie deficit more easy for them to stick to based on their preferences and how it's set up. Any of this stuff related to circadian eating or chrononutrition is more looking at this from a health standpoint typically, but there are implications for body composition, which I'll come to. So first things I would say is in relation to the timing of meals, what we know relatively clearly, and I think is pretty uncontroversial, is that eating at biological night, particularly into the night, leads to a worse metabolism of carbohydrate and fat. Protein seems to be a bit different, and this is probably something you probably would have seen with, for example, Luc van Loon's work and some of the stuff that came out of the Netherlands, where we tend to see almost complete protein digestion even when that's given like intranasally overnight. So protein might be a bit different, but we definitely see fat metabolism and carb metabolism getting completely screwed up at night. If you look at shift workers and when they have a meal with that in, you tend to see hyperglycemia and hyperlipemia. That's way worse than at other times. There's also then more associational data of people that are having large amounts of their calories close to sleep onset tend to be correlated with worse body composition in terms of more fat mass overall. And there's also some metabolic health markers there too. There's then several intervention studies where they've compared the exact same meal eaten in the morning versus, say, late in the evening. And again, you see differences in carbohydrate and fat metabolism. So you see blood glucose go higher and stay higher for longer in that meal eaten at night versus earlier in the day for that same person, and the meal is the exact same. So we know there's a difference there, and we'll maybe come back to the clinical significance later on. The probably more interesting question, I think, beyond just looking at the meal timing is probably the energy distribution across the day. That's one that I think is really fascinating. One of the big studies that caught a lot of people's attention, although there are several limitations to this study, admittedly, was a 2013 paper by Daniela Jakubowicz and some of her colleagues that looked at a 1,400 calorie dieting intervention. The differences between the two groups was just how they distributed that energy. So it's 3 meals a day, and it was either a 700 calorie breakfast, 500 calorie lunch, 200 calorie dinner, or the reverse, 200 calorie breakfast, 500 calorie lunch, 700 calorie dinner. And over the course of that study, you ended up seeing massive differences in the weight they lost, their waist circumference, and then kind of obviously from that point, you saw differences in blood glucose, fasting insulin, and so on, which we actually expect when we see more fat loss. But that was kind of one of these studies that makes you stand up and say, well, this is weird. All they got people to do was have a different distribution of their energy. Now, what I think is fair to say is that the magnitude of difference in weight loss was something like 4.5 kilos, if I remember correctly. It was pretty large for that study. But I don't think all of that was simply because of the food was eaten at different times. So there wasn't rigorous control so the food wasn't given to participants, for example. It was self-reported mainly with check-ins with a dietitian. So we can't be exactly sure that they actually ate exactly as they should have. And we don't really have good data on their energy expenditure from what I can remember from that study. So it's hard to know exactly what was going on, but at least from a practical sense, just changing the distribution of energy saw differences there. Now, there's been other studies that in a similar fashion have looked at changing energy distribution across the day. And even if there's not a difference in body composition, what is really repeatable and you see nearly across the board is improvements for blood glucose and insulin. So glycemic markers tend to virtually in every study see to be better when you have more of the energy pushed early in the day than a lot of it late in the evening. And this probably goes back to, like we said, there's differences from a circadian perspective in insulin sensitivity across the day. There's a circadian rhythm to beta cell function. So the beta cells secrete insulin. Beta cell function tends to be higher in the morning than in the evening, for example. And then there's also this other interesting area when it comes to body composition that potentially pushing more of those calories earlier in the day, at least the hypothesis would be if that leads to someone expending more energy across the day, then maybe you could see a body composition difference. Either for the same number of calories, that person can be in let's say a calorie deficit rather than maintenance, or that person can maintain their body weight and a higher number of calories. And there's a couple of studies we can talk about if you wish. So there's that element of the distribution, which I probably think is the most interesting. One that's pretty clear, I would say, is consistency from day to day. That what's termed in literature as erratic eating tends to be associated with a lot of negative outcomes, particularly, again, for glycemic control. So this would be where someone has massive changes in the times of day that they eat or the number of meals they eat from day to day. There was a really nice study that Sachin Panda and his colleagues did where they had people they had people track it in an app, and you could see that there's, for example, very common that people have a 2 to 3 hour delay in their normal meal times at weekends compared to during the week. And so they said they use the term metabolic jet lag as a way to reference the same things might be going on from a circadian perspective as we would see with jet lag or social jet lag, which is this phenomenon of people sleeping in later at the weekend, and then Monday rolls around and they have this phase shift and they end up having some of the symptoms we associate with jet lag. So, and there's also another study out of the UK where they compared like 3 main meals a day and I think, 3 main meals and maybe 3 snacks versus a group that would go from anywhere between 3 meals and 9 meals a day, but randomly changing every day for the 2 weeks. And again, at the end, you see worse glycemic markers in terms of glucose and insulin in the irregular group. So I think consistency probably is, I would say that's relatively uncontroversial, and I think it actually makes some sense because we know the same thing happens with sleep and wake times. I think that's pretty routine, standard recommendation people would give for sleep with someone that's struggling is try and have relatively consistent times that you wake and go to bed. And whenever there's a big change in those, you tend to have these knock-on negative effects. So whether that's social jet lag or otherwise. And then the final kind of area where we could get into as much detail as we need to is the whole how much of a restriction on our feeding window does someone need? Does it make much of a difference? Why is it causing a difference? But relatively routinely, if you just get someone to restrict within a certain number of hours that they are consuming their meals, we tend to see improvements in glycemic markers quite reliably. Quite often it leads to weight loss, and that's just because they end up consuming less calories overall. So I don't think that necessarily is doing anything magical, but what it is doing is it's allowing people to be able to stick to an intervention that ends up having some of these benefits. So for me, with all that whole ramble, a few basic things I would say to people is probably avoiding eating late or close to sleep onset is probably a good idea. I would say probably give at least 2 hours plus of a time where you're not consuming nutrients. Particularly try and have that last feeding of the day not very high calorie load, particularly not high in fat and carbohydrate, I think is probably a good idea. Where possible, maybe think about distributing some of the energy a bit earlier if it suits. And then having some sort of feeding window that isn't just I'm going to eat from as soon as I get up right until I'm going to go to bed. Because we know that the typical feeding window in the average population tends to be somewhere between 15 to 16 hours. And quite reliably, just shrinking that down tends to be beneficial. Beyond that, it's hard to give very specific things. So, for example, I think it's a good idea to probably eat something early-ish in the day, but that doesn't necessarily mean breakfast. That could be the first several hours, but how many hours it is, I don't actually know, and it's hard to know how much of a difference that makes. But I think what's probably more important is probably where's the bulk of those calories coming. If I were to guess what's the most important, it's like where is the highest percentage of your calories, at what point in the day are they eaten by? And probably having that a bit earlier or in line with daylight is probably better off. And I think the calorie distribution issue is something that sometimes gets left out when people are trying to work out what is the best length of a feeding window, right? How long should I fast for and how long should I feed for? Because if we're comparing, let's say, an 8-hour feeding window with a 10-hour feeding window, it's hard to, like right now, we don't know if any one of them is necessarily better. But let's say we got to a place where we did have research showing 8 is definitely better than 10. And quite reliably, that if you have this kind of like, say, 3 meals across 8 hours versus 3 meals across 10, 8 hours is winning. Well, then what happens if we were to, with the 10 hours, switch the energy distributions that most of that calories are consumed in the first half of that 10-hour period, and there's only a couple of light meals later on. That kind of changes the dynamic there. And I think those little intricate, nuanced things are very difficult to get at with some of the current research we have. So yeah, it's hard to give specific answers beyond that. But I don't know if that even answered your question, but there are things that pop to mind.
It definitely did. And I also like what you said right there, that the interaction between calorie distribution within a feeding window and the length of that feeding window are independent and basically affecting one another to change outcomes. So I know there were probably some people who've had a lot of success with the lean gains approach, when you were explaining the study about having breakfast, lunch, and dinner, and the group that shifted their calories earlier in the day, they might have been like, that's not my experience at all. But I think they need to remember that this is not necessarily a time-restricted feeding study. It was just a distribution of calories. And when you are doing quote-unquote lean gains, not only are you using typically an 8-hour window, sometimes a 10, but you're also then shifting calories back. So there's a lot of things at play here. And correct me if I'm wrong, Danny, but I believe there is research where they've compared different feeding windows earlier or later in the day, and they both look pretty good, but maybe it leans in the direction of one being better than the other. But there seems to be a pretty strong independent effect on metabolic outcomes from having a feeding window at all. Is that an accurate characterization?
Yeah, so quite clearly when you go from habitual diet to having some sort of restricted feeding window, quite reliably you're seeing improvements for, and maybe various reasons that we could debate, but quite regularly you're seeing improvements for people in most of these metabolic markers. The only real study from the past year which I saw that compared the early to late in like an exact same manner, I think it was the Sutton paper from last year, where it was a 9-hour feeding window, and it was either from 8 a.m. to 5, I think, versus 12 p.m. to 9. And there pretty much everything seemed to be pretty much the same. I think the only difference was there was a slight benefit for the early window with 24-hour glucose. Although like it was statistically significant, although maybe not clinically that significant. But everything else seemed to be pretty good. So it seems that, at least from that study, it would seem that it might not mean as much about where you place it. Although that is kind of surprising based on some of the mechanistic stuff we see with circadian rhythms and insulin sensitivity and some of the other things we've discussed already, that you would have guessed that there might be a benefit to earlier. Now, we might find that there is as more of these studies come out. But like I said, maybe the thing isn't necessarily the exact timing of the window, but when those calories would have been consumed. And what you end up happening in, I think, a non-trivially a number of cases with people who try and follow a lean gains approach because, let's say, they really enjoy eating large meals at night, is a large skew of calories to really late in the day. So almost saving as much as I can, and then I feel I can gorge late in the day. And there's a few things I would say on that. First is that it completely makes sense that people would report that they've had success in a certain protocol, because again, you're still accounting for a certain number of calories, you're making sure to get protein in, you're doing resistance training most commonly, and if you do those things, you can make progress towards a body composition goal. That's not really up for debate. The question is, would there be any differences if you set it up differently? And that's almost impossible for us to answer for one individual person. One of the claims that some people have is that they tried, or maybe they prefer that method because they're not that hungry in the morning and they get really hungry in the evening. But I do think there's also a learned effect to that. And there's actually been some studies that suggest this, that even, I think it was a study by Thomas where they showed people who routinely did intermittent fasting where their first meal wasn't till like 12 p.m., that they didn't see the same detriment to or a worse glucose excursion following that first meal than people who routinely had breakfast but then skipped breakfast one day. Because we see that quite commonly. If you skip breakfast and you usually consume breakfast, you see a worse glycemic response. But it seems like you can adapt that. If you skip breakfast every day, it doesn't seem to have the same problem. Now, what's probably I think also going on with a lot of people is the reason why they're ravenously hungry at night and not in the morning is if you get used to eating large meals at night and not eating, then you're not going to be hungry when you wake up the next day because you've had a ton of calories the night before. But then by the time the evening comes, of course, you are. And so it may take some time to adapt. And then there's also the obvious case where for just some people, that's going to suit them better. There's going to be genetic variation regardless. And we're starting to see a couple of papers that are trying to take account for chronotype. So whether people are like early types or late types and how their chronotype may affect the negatives or not that may occur with some of this nutrient timing. So it may be the case that some people can eat later and not have the same downsides based on chronotype. There's still some work being done in that area. But yeah, so I think there's that's one of the criticisms that tends to get leveled at this of eating preference time, and I totally understand it.
Yeah,
I think it's also really important now to go, hey, like we talk about the value of anecdotes here and experiences, and we don't just discount them because hashtag evidence-based, which is actually not evidence-based. But there are some pretty important limitations of anecdotes. I think a lot of the people who become the most fervent advocates and experience the most success with the Lean Gains approach have to remember that they've self-selected that. They weren't randomized into a study where they were put on either a late or an early time-restricted window. And it may be the convergence of those genetic factors or whatever factors that may be there, circadian, preference or predilection in their physiology, and then also some experience with it. And then also that it does become a learned behavior. It's very much a similar thing that you see in folks who struggle with binge eating. When someone comes to me and goes, hey, I've been trying to stay lean after this cut, and I had a day where I had a blowout. How would I fix it now? And I go, please don't fix it, because that is actually going to become a large contributor to the cause of why it happens again. And so I think just like you were saying, it's a really good point. If you're eating a huge meal at 9 p.m., why would you be hungry at 8 a.m.? So all these things intersect to create the experiences people have. And I think that's something that we have to, just kind of really kind of keep that nuance detector pretty high and be aware of context as we go through this discussion. Because you're setting fires, Danny. You're like, hey, all the folks who think they need protein every 3 hours, I'm gonna set that idol on fire. All people who love intermittent fasting, I'm gonna set that idol on fire. I think, like you said, probably the only non-controversial thing you said is that consistency in meal timing is not a bad idea.
Right, yeah.
But even then, I would say there was a time point in the meal plans versus if it fits your macros war, where even the sacred cow of eating a relatively consistent time period throughout the day was burned. It's like, hey, the only thing that matters is hitting your macros, and you can have that all in one meal,
right.
Which I think is died off a little bit, and it's understood that was probably just a reaction to the 6 meals per day, eat every 3 hours, rigid meal plan approach. But that's the problem with these reactionary approaches, where everything associated with the other side is now wrong or up for debate or questionable because, you disagree now and you're on separate sides. So I think this is a really valuable meta discussion we'll come back to. But anyway.
I think what I need to do now is create my own protocol that actually calls for people to have irregular meal timings to confuse the body, which get the metabolism all confused. So it ramps up and can in its fearful state.
Yeah,
So that's what I
meal
think we
timing
need to do.
confusion. I love it.
Yeah, but I think they're great points. But you're going to jump in.
Yeah, I was gonna say, Danny. I think it's safe to say, Danny, that you will never be a successful guru, just because, as Eric said, you're throwing too many torches and you're lighting too many things on fire. Where you are following "Thou shalt not worship false idols" too seriously. Because just while you were talking, I was lighting up with different marketing ideas. Where I was thinking, if we call it the Lennon limit. So that's like kind of your nutritional approach. Hey, alliteration, always sexy. Something I want to throw in before I get back to Danny in particular, what Eric said, it's interesting when individuals self-select, where almost not even personality type, but if you believe the belief in the efficacy of a certain protocol and the rhetoric might appeal to you, will increase your adherence to that program. So there's nothing magical in the program, but the simple fact that for some reason it appeals to you is like, oh, you know what, I'm like kind of a counter-establishment type of person. So like everyone's telling me eat 6 meals a day. This individual is telling me instead fast for a while, have a 6-hour window. It's like, well, I'm actually going to follow through with that instead of what I used to do before, because now I have this belief due to the rhetoric and what I've been hearing and a bunch of other things. Then I do it and I get better results. Therefore, it's better overall. I'm like, well, wait a second here. You're throwing too many fires though, because you mentioned that 2013 study. And you could have taken that logical leap to say that it just that breakfast just completely kickstarted their metabolism, and you didn't. And I was disappointed in you for that. And I'm going to say something that you hate, Danny. I think that is the true evidence-based approach, where sometimes we had, shout out to our Game Changers episode, where individuals look at a perfect intersection of different things. So an ethical argument, then a biological argument where it's superior also, either veganism or whatever your current dogmatic viewpoint is. And when you have that intersection between all things, well, let's go ahead and do it. And one of my favorite aspects when we had you on the carbohydrate discussion, I'm not sure if I told you that in that discussion, is kind of where you take a look. It's almost a look outside of the small scope. So it's a big scope. And then you try and see if there is, in fact, intersection. So you talk about the triangle of body composition, performance, and health. And so you think, okay, there are improvements in health markers. Does that then also impact, someone's body composition? Does it or does it not? The two can actually be completely separate. And I think that's the lens that you take a look at all these things where, as Eric said, Martin Berkham, it was kind of a practitioner that was trying to take useful things to help his clients adhere and get better results. It's like, well, wait a second. Let's take a look outside that. Let's take a look at the biology, the intersection between, the chronology, circadian rhythms, and then nutrition, see what happens. And then are there any things that might be beneficial or does it only apply to health? So I like that you're willing to burn everything down in the search of the ultimate truth. So I just have to commend you. I like the balance. And then when you reframe it, man, as a heuristic where it's like, hey, here's essentially a useful set of guidelines that might not always 100% apply. And also the mechanisms might be what we think the reason why might be wrong, but it seems like for whatever reason, these might be useful. Here you go. And I like how, not that you're hesitant to recommend them, but there's so many caveats before you launch. I don't know, Eric. He sounds pretty #evidence-based to me.
Yeah, I might even have to take the hashtag away. It might just be evidence-based.
Well, one thing I would say, I think this is actually a really good point, and I think the lean gains example illustrates this perfectly, is that when people have a certain either ideology or approach that they just really like that has worked for them, and the instinct is when they hear something that sounds like it's contrary to that is to become defensive. And then they will say the phrase that I hate more than anything else when I put out something. Someone will say, so what you're saying is? And it's like, no, because if I was saying that, that's what I would have said. What I said was what I said, right? So when, for example, anything that I discussed never... So if someone that's, for example, is listening and they've done something like lean gains or daily intermittent fasting or eat a ton of their calories late at night and have got into great shape and really enjoy doing that, and they might be saying, well, this is nonsense because I did this, or are you saying then that Martin Berkham is wrong, or are you... It's like, no, I didn't say any of that, right? It doesn't invalidate any of those things. You can absolutely do all those protocols and get shredded. You can do that and actually still be healthy, right? There are also, apart from the self-selection, you have a population of people who are also doing things like resistance training and into fitness. So they're restricting their calories to an appropriate amount. So they're doing all these things. All we've really discussed is that, hey, we have some data suggesting when you eat certain meals can have different impacts on your metabolic health and glycemic markers. And for certain people, that matters more than others. So let's take the people who that matter the most for. That would be people, let's say, who aren't going to be training all the time, who are super lean, who maybe have a problem restricting calories via other measures, or let's say are not going to follow an approach where they're tracking calories and macros. Now something like shrinking your feeding window and also maybe pushing some of that intake earlier in the day, and let's say having a cutoff of like, let's just not eat past 7 p.m. for a multitude of reasons, whether that's circadian, physiological, or even just psychological and habit-based, that most commonly would help that person probably eat a more appropriate amount of food and would probably help them with their glycemic control. And for someone who maybe has already got some degree of insulin resistance, that probably makes a lot of sense. That still doesn't say anything about, hey, if you're doing lean gains, you can't get shredded. Of course you can. It's just that there are things that we need to be aware of saying it doesn't matter when you eat is not actually correct. And there may be a benefit for many people to not having large meals late at night for some of these reasons. And there may be benefits for moving that earlier in the day. So understanding what is being said rather than I feel like this is going to go against something I want to, so I'm immediately going to, and this is just normal psychology. Like this is like Danny Kahneman's work 101, right? We're going to kick into this gear of trying to search for reasons to back up what we're doing without actually really listening to what's being said. So I'm sympathetic to those who may disagree with some of those points, but it's probably not pushing back against them as much as they think it is, I would say, in most of those cases.
That's really well said, Danny. And I'm going to speak directly to our listener here because I know the folks who listen to Iron Culture like to be challenged. And you can only like that so much as a human. Like we said from basic psychology, it's still going to trigger you. It's still going to get you to respond defensively because that's how we deal with the worldview. We like, especially if someone who is fitness and health is important to you, you seek out the best knowledge, the best of your capability, and you set up a protocol based on that. And you go, okay, that's taken care of. I'm safe. And then, we bring somebody on and we challenge you. Right. And that's why you listen. Because in the end, the hopeful outcome is that you're able to better recalibrate those set of things, and it updates over time, which is the cornerstone of being evidence-based, is that knowledge changes and we're always getting a little bit closer, but we will never actually reach the truth. And even more importantly, the truth is different for every single person over time and in different situations. So you have to become adaptable rather than believing in these sacred cows or creating these 10 commandments, if you will. So I really like that you said that, Danny. And I think it's just such a critical point, and I don't want to go too far off on a philosophical tangent. So I'll bring it back to something that's a little more physiology based. And I think people sometimes underestimate the power of resistance training and being physically active. So I can't tell you how often lifters in our community act like they are the most sensitive snowflakes ever when it comes to the things they need to do with nutrition or training or the things that they think might make a difference. Like how many times I've had some, jacked bodybuilder, male or female, come to me and ask me about insulin sensitivity when I know that they get 10,000 steps a day, they're physically active, they're under the age of 30, they have their macros timed out, they eat fruits and vegetables every day, and I know that they probably have the most robust defense against poor metabolization of nutrients, that they need to worry about whether they should have a 40% fat diet or a 20% fat diet. I think what people forget is it's not just about optimization. At a certain point, some of the things you do make it so that your circle of what could be considered optimal is increasing. And I think that's something that's missed when we're in this hunt for optimal. It's like just the act of being active, not overweight, resistance training, and getting regular sleep means it's not even getting away with it. they're equivalent. Like some things are no longer optimizable. You are bringing glucose and lipids across cells at a much greater rate. You're using them. You don't have a ton of nutrients just sitting in your blood because you're sedentary and overeating. So, does it really matter if we look at these minute differences in substrate metabolization? So I think that's something where people just probably underestimate it because they kind of think from a worldview of, well, everyone lifts weights,
Right.
So yeah,
that's the thing.
So a big caveat, I think, for all of this research, maybe all of it, is that, or at least the vast majority of it is on kind of everyday folks in Western societies, and yeah, so that's something to consider. A lot of the times we're dealing with overweight or obese individuals or people with poor metabolic health who are not exercising, and yeah. So I don't know if you want to comment on that.
Yeah, I just want to say quick, sorry. So Eric, to be clear, we're talking, when we say the everyday population, we're talking more Becky from Walmart, not Berto from the gym, is what you're saying.
Nailed it.
Okay.
Right. And like, that's a really important point, that sure, we can talk about how big of an issue, let's say, insulin resistance is and how the prevalence of that. But again, you have to look at what the average person's lifestyle is right now. And that ties into it. And of course, there's going to be exceptions to that. But I think the resistance training one is also interesting for a reason that I think I mentioned in the article, of that some of the changes we see, for example, in insulin sensitivity across the day, regardless of your normal insulin sensitivity status, it tends to decline throughout the day. And then hypothetically, large carbohydrate load at night may be worse than earlier in the day. That can be offset from resistance training. And a lot of people, particularly if they work like a 9-to-5 job, may end up training in the evening. And if you've just gone and lifted some weights, you actually can have this glucose disposal without the need for insulin. So it's this insulin independent glucose disposal. And so you won't have this huge glucose excursion that you otherwise would have had because you've lifted weights, even if your muscle cells are a bit more insulin resistant than normal. But again, as you said, Eric, for someone who is regularly physically active, particularly in the lifting community, the chances of most of those folks being heavily insulin resistant is low anyway. So I think remembering those things is important. And then going back to my original point, that I'm happy for people to open up the discussion of how much does this matter for me as an individual? How much of this is clinically meaningful? That's actually a really good question. And that's one that you could only question when we take into an individual circumstances. However, that still doesn't negate the original point that we're making, is that doesn't mean that none of this stuff matter. It doesn't matter, right? So you can say that, yeah, for me, I don't really mind, or I'm not going to focus on any of this timing stuff because I can be healthy anyway. I don't think it's really going to matter that much, blah, blah, blah. You can justify all those things and you might be right. But what you can't say is that when you eat meals doesn't matter. That's just too much of a blanket statement. That's just obviously not true. There is a difference. Whether that difference matters to you or not is another question. And actually, it's a really good question and worth thinking about. But just noticing that they're different is what avoids all the trouble that we mentioned at the start.
Now, Danny, yeah, I was going to say, just indulge us for a second here for the Lennon limit protocol, hashtag, trademark. Let's have a practical component now for the podcast with all that's been said. You train clients, you coach individuals. Let's say you have an individual. What's the intake form look like then? What are some of the heuristics, the decisions that you make for an individual when you give recommendations from a practical standpoint? So someone now, they want to be coached by you. They hear some of these things. How do you tweak, if anything, the protocol once you have someone? What are some of the questions you ask? What's that process look like?
I don't ask any questions that say, this is what you're doing. No,
this is the plan. This is the master plan. You let it
breakfast.
This is the one protocol. Yeah. So most of it is going to be built around like where's their current starting point. I don't think this is probably news to maybe any coaches, of getting an idea of where someone is at, both in terms of what they're currently doing. Where is really their bottlenecks to progress? Is it simply a knowledge issue? A lot of the time it's actually not. At least for the typical demographic that we work with. Then is it down to their ability to adhere to a specific plan? What's causing that loss of adherence for them? Is it running counter to their lifestyle, their schedule? Are they trying to do things that are making the diet unnecessarily restrictive, et cetera, et cetera? Once we kind of understand where that individual's main bottleneck is to making progress, then we can start suggesting a few things to change. If we're talking specifically about where some of this timing stuff might come in, this would again be based on questions around how likely is it, number one, that suggesting some of these changes, like timing changes, is something that person's actually going to stick to. If it's going to make it unnecessarily difficult for them to stick to the fundamentals of nutrition, of overall how much are they eating, what does their overall food quality look like, are they getting sufficient protein for their training or body composition goals, etc. If that undermines any of those to make it more difficult to stick to, or it's going to lead to a loss of adherence of those, then it's probably not worth me saying, hey, can you shift more of your calories early in the day, because it's just not going to be, the trade-off is not worth it. However, in cases where it might not be a problem, so one simple example is if someone generally doesn't have much structure to when they have their meals across the day, or it's kind of quite sporadic, we can say, hey, maybe we're going to trial for the moment sticking to this meal frequency, right? Let's have 3 main meals, 1 to 2 snacks within a 12-hour window to start with. Right, so I want you to have the first meal like 8 a.m., cut off the last one at 8 p.m. Let's run with that for a while, see how it works out. That's something that we can assess for a lot of people would be probably relatively easy to go with. And if not, then we can change, but they can start with that. And based on that, then we can make some more kind of changes over time. It might be a small change if we're noticing, hey, they're actually keeping a lot of their calories until that kind of very final meal. Maybe we just take a few hundred of those and say, hey, why don't you try and push some of those into your meal in the middle of the day that you have 3 hours before you go train. See how you feel. Maybe your training seems a bit better, maybe not. Just see how it plays out. There's some of the things we can try and do, but with the caveat of, like I said, if it undermines their adherence to the most important things of their overall intake, their overall quality, macronutrient, etc., the things that we know that everyone probably listening to this probably knows about. They might know a book that kind of talks through some of these things. I don't know. If it undermines any of those, then there's no point in going further with this discussion. But I think one of the beautiful things about some of the interventions we're seeing with under the chrononutrition umbrella, for example, time-restricted feeding, is that it's a really simple intervention. It requires next to no nutrition education on behalf of that person. Like, we're seeing benefits for people who are not counseled on what to eat at all and not told to change what to eat, just simply change their meal times and just like shrink in that window a bit, and you still see some of these benefits. So at scale, for people who don't understand nutrition, who don't track macros, who are not listening to a podcast like this, some of these changes are useful. And that's why I call them heuristics, that they're not guidelines you must follow in order to be successful. But what we're seeing is people who do some of these things actually, for whatever reason, and we're still working out some of the mechanisms, are finding benefits. So it's worth trying, particularly if you work with clients who don't want to track macros, who don't even know what macros are. Then you might find it useful to say, here, we're going to try and get your food within this certain feeding window, or we're going to try and, can we not have as much at that final meal, maybe push it a bit earlier, just see how you feel, and then work from there.
Eric, are you hearing this bullshit? Like, are you hearing what he's trying to imply here about the Lennon limit nutritional model, that somehow one of the variables he's trying to take into account the individual? So he's trying to predict how humans actually would behave and not how we want them to behave. Because we both know we're input-output machines, but he seems to be implying that it's a little bit more complicated than that.
Yeah, what you're joking about is actually a really important consideration, in that the way, Danny, you're assessing what to do for the individual, and what you're, ironically criticizing Omar, is that a lot of the times there's not an acknowledgement that there's a signal to noise ratio between physiology and behavior, and certain physiological things are less or more important, or less or more incontrovertible, and certain behavioral things for the individual may or may not be negotiable or easily changeable, and that's going to be a different kind of outcome, I would say, at the individual level and almost societally when we look at things. So a great example of a physiology that was easily subsumed by behavior is the obesity epidemic. We've seen body weights just climb and climb and climb on average as food availability has gone up, food price has gone down, calorie density has gone up, and hyperpalatability has gone up, and our reduced need to move has increased. So, but another example is, it doesn't matter what you do. No matter what type of scheme, you go to any book in the aisle of health and fitness. If you can't get yourself in a calorie deficit, you're simply not going to lose weight. There's no way around it. So those are two examples where physiology trumps in one scenario and behavior trumps in another. And I think that's exactly what you're getting at here. It's like, hey, the Martin Berkhan lean gains approach might have looked at a specific population, mostly younger men who were busy and had jobs, who seemed to do a lot better with this protocol. And then he looked at the research and found the intersection there. And it was a slightly different signal to noise ratio than you might see with someone in kind of the situation you talked about, where they could actually better align with some of these slightly better time restricted windows that are earlier in the day, or shifting calories earlier in the day versus later. A very common thing that we're seeing in that lean gains group is they're also training in the afternoon or the evening. So like you said, that could also be greatly influencing those things. So understanding that nuance and understanding that strict adherence to just physiology or just behavior could be leaving something on the table, and in some cases be a complete prevention of you getting to your goals, depending on the context and what physiology we're talking about, is I think kind of a critical meta piece to what we've been talking about.
Yeah, that's really fascinating, because only the other day or last week, actually, I did a Q&A episode for the podcast, and I got this absolutely cracker of a question. That was the last question, and it mirrored what we just said. And it was, to paraphrase, it was something to the effect of, James, who's a listener of the podcast, said, I'm kind of noticing within nutritional science a move from a physicalist-based approach to a more phenomenological-based approach. Are you noticing something similar, and how far would you like to see it to go? And so kind of just for some context, the way I took up that question was, again, related to kind of philosophy of, if we look at physicalism being this focus on physically, what are these things that are here and how do they interact? And then phenomenological can take into account things like consciousness, for example, that it's very hard to measure, impossible almost to measure within a brain scan in neuroscience, for example, or things like human perception and emotion and so on. And so the way he was translating that into nutrition is kind of classically, if we look at nutrition and science, it was about what is in food, right? What it's made up of, these calories and these macronutrients and these micronutrients and these various vitamins and minerals. We need X amount of these minerals to avoid a deficiency. We need these kind of macronutrients and these building block, blah, blah, blah. And this would be kind of mirror that physicalist-based approach. And now we have this emergence more so of other factors that people realize are part of the nutrition conversation that go beyond anything to do with food, right? How do we feel when we're around food? What is that environment? What does it mean for us culturally? What does it mean in terms of our past life experiences? How psychological experiences and issues that have happened in the past can affect our food choices, how it makes us feel, how stigma plays a role, like all these other aspects can play a role that are distinct. And it's not that one. And so his question of how far we should go, mine was, well, we should go as far as we can with all that stuff because it's really good, but not to the point where we completely forget about any of the rules of physicalism, right? That we just say, oh, it doesn't matter about calories, or it doesn't matter about micronutrients. It's all about how you feel around food and to be empowered and so on. And I think that kind of mirrors what we're saying here, that physiology can't ever alone explain things. And it's a lot of times superseded by stuff. But as you say, you can't just disregard it because it still holds true anyway. And it's just interesting that you brought up that point, Eric, at a time when something similar I just came across.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's obvious that there's a huge philosophical discussion we could go down, and I'm going to acknowledge that doorway, salute it, but I'm not going to walk down it. We'll be here for 3 hours and walk right past it. But I think in many ways, the quote unquote evidence-based community is kind of often paying off debts, or we are dealing with problems that we created for ourselves down the line because of the approach we previously took. I think one that I want to address that's really, really interesting is that we all know that pseudoscience comes at the edge of what we know scientifically. Whenever there's, and I think I've talked about this on Iron Culture before, whenever there's something that we know enough about to be interested in it, for it to be a sexy headline or a clickbait title, but we can't say enough about it of what it can or can't do. And I'm going to give you some real good examples. CBD oil, right? Fasting, another great one that's kind of out now. So chrononutrition is only now starting to get a fair amount of hard data behind it. And the problem is that 5 years ago, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 years ago, it was just this kind of bleeding edge. We know a little bit about it. Circadian rhythms are interesting. And it was the realm of biohackers. It was these guys wearing, orange tinted glasses talking about how they hacked X, Y, or Z. And they bring up the word circadian. They say something about light. And it sounds like, oh, that's the enemy, So the problem is, the self-created problem is that when we're approached with these biohacker pseudoscientists who are trying to push a product with something that is science-y, or at least the entrance into the room is based on science, but then the conclusions based upon it are huge reaches, is that they become the target of our whack-a-mole, which is kind of the standard approach of quote-unquote evidence-based fitness, I would say in like 2010, was simply, I'm going to find something to debunk and debunk it and debunk it and debunk it. And all I'm doing all day is telling you what's bullshit, what's BS, who's a charlatan, what's wrong, and not really spending much time telling you what to do or actually helping you build critical thinking. And now the problem with that is that you are becoming the anti-guru guru. So everyone just, what do they take from that? Chrononutrition is BS. And now we're sitting here having to backpedal and explain to people who listened to our content 10 years ago of why, oh, just kidding. Yeah, what that guy said at that time might have been incorrect, but actually chrononutrition is this robust field with studies being done at like Yale and Oxford and shit like that. And I think the take-home message here is that maybe we should be moving forward with an evidence-first perspective being evidence-based. Call me crazy, but simply not trying to make these attacks against a certain concept, but just evaluating a claim and saying what we do know rather than saying this is and then label it with some kind of moral judgment. Because I think that's gotten us into hot water repeatedly and repeatedly.
Helms.
Yeah.
Yeah. I was just gonna, go on.
No, I was going to say that it's people will make a judgment first on who is saying it and whether that person is within their camp or not. And they will, in some cases, dismiss something because the wrong person said it. And in other places, give way too much leeway to someone that's within their group saying something and not applying the same degree of scrutiny, rather than do what you say of, let's take each claim and say, well, is this actually accurate? Is this backed up by something? And let's just evaluate things on evidence. And there's also the fallacy that occurs of when you have someone who has said something and you know that person is a complete, let's say, a pseudoscientific charlatan person, and they've said something, but now you end up attaching all the blame to the topic that they've talked about. And so now anyone that talks about that is obviously in the same boat. That's just not accurate either. You have to evaluate what someone is actually saying as opposed to just a general topic, which is essentially the point you made.
Yeah, we talked about that with Dr. Fundero on gut health. She's someone who did a PhD looking at this, and now she gets lumped in with anyone who's like, I'm gonna cure your past lives by addressing the gut flora and fauna of your body. So like, it's a very frustrating thing for anyone who is studying an emerging field that there are people who are taking advantage of that. But it's not just the issue of the people who are taking advantage of that. It's also how we in the evidence-based community try to police false claims. And I think when we make it a moralistic argument, or when we attack people or attack their character or point them out, or the kind of the call-out culture that is more about calling out the person than the claim, creates these issues and creates these divisions and makes someone like yourself or Dr. Fundero get attacked from within because you're even discussing something that might have been said by some biohacker at some point. And people are already tuned out and unable to hear what the actual data might be.
Yeah.
Right.
I do want to take that pause, Helms, and just tell you that I thought what you said before was straight fire. You should know I'm giving you that dopamine drip of, a congratulations and a compliment there.
That Omar approval I need.
Yeah, no, I thought you were on point. I mean, we could go on so many different tangents here, but let's quote our boy Nietzsche, where he said that careful when wrestling with monsters, you don't become a monster yourself. That sometimes in wrestling dogma, you become dogmatic. That individuals in the evidence-based community, where it's like, wait a sec, you don't listen to this. This is silly, like to the complete exclusion, no nuance whatsoever. And that's why, to what I said, I would say I was kind of making a parody about certain economic models, where individuals, old economic models, and I want to talk just marketing briefly, what you said about those orange tinted glasses. Old economic models made a very tenuous assumption that individuals will act in a rational manner. So in other words, what would benefit them most? And the way it plays out, it doesn't often play out that way. And that's a huge variable they're attempting to control in order to explain everything else. And the whole concept behind a lot of what I've been hearing here, or chrononutrition, is that we should try and create models that help accurately predict how humans will behave or what would be best for them, rather than holding them as a constant variable where it's an assumed, it's a known. It's like, oh, no, we know this. It's like, I actually would put forth the notion that it's the opposite. We know much more about science, so the calories, what matters most for body composition. But in terms of people actually adhering to this, that's kind of the gray area that deserves more attention. So this beautiful intersection that we're seeing right here when it comes to chrononutrition, when it comes to some of these behavioral patterns of what someone will actually do to get their results, man, I think it's fascinating. And it's always a bad position. I think you said it best about being a late adopter. You're speaking about supplements, but I think it kind of applies to a lot of things. That, individuals here, where they want to put forth, they want to have a reactionary almost response. So they hear, as you said, someone on the bleeding edge, they'll say something, and they understand that once again, yeah, it might be tenuous what they're saying. Is there hard data to support it? But then they'll just come out completely and attack it, the moralistic argument, without then waiting and seeing. And I think taking into account the economic argument, and I will make that greater marketing one, that individuals want to stand out, right, in any market. If you're just parroting the known, so yeah, hey guys, like, guess what, you got to be in a calorie deficit in order to lose weight. That's a known, that's a given. And so if you want to peacock above the herd, you kind of have to say, not you have to, but saying crazy shit, like it's no
it
shade
works, at least.
Yeah, Eric, it's no shade on Rogan. And that's why someone made a comment when I announced, like, whatever, we crossed a certain threshold. It's like, you guys should be on Rogan. I said we would be unapologetic. We would have to decide if we'd want to do that. But Rogan would say, yeah, so I feel like on keto it makes me perform better. And Eric would say, well, I understand and I respect your subjective experience on keto, that you felt that it improved your performance. However, we have to take a look at the actual hard data and the outcomes for individuals, and individuals that are looking to optimize their body composition when it comes to hypertrophy. Likely a ketogenic diet would not be beneficial. And then he would say, well, like, have you ever tried DMT though? I'm like, that is not, Rogan, what we're talking about here. I think that late adopter approach that you said, though, not waiting and seeing, but understanding that it's okay to not know. And that's maybe one of the huge tenets that's counter to being a guru, is that it's okay to say that I don't know, or as Danny says, the heuristics right there, where it's like, well, here are some rules that we might not know the mechanism, and they seem to be helpful. These are signposts. I'm not going to use Mike Teixeira's most existential analogy, but these are signposts along the way. So I just got to give respect and a respect.
Thank you, Omar.
Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, I think the philosophy behind this is deep, because I think there are so many things we have to do as evidence-based professionals, and I'll go ahead and say it, because evidence-based does mean something. As much as people have diluted the term, the roots of evidence-based medicine are really, really important. I don't think we can actually lose that terminology. We don't want to, because we want to have the kind of three pillars of science, personal preference, and our experiences to guide us, even if evidence-based is not referring to people who are actually doing that. But the tendencies of people who are in this community is to want answers. And what you're getting at, Omar, is that probably one of the most dangerous and and problematic things we can do is because people who enter the evidence-based field are people who want there to be answers and they're curious and they want to find the answer, and that we're socially rewarded as leaders to have answers, is to provide confident answers when there actually is not one. So yeah, the counterintuitive thing that we need to do as voices in the community is to be very clear and very confident and very comfortable with not knowing shit when we don't know it, and to be honest about that. And I think that's something that you've done a really good job with in this discussion, Danny, is reaffirming the limits of what we know. Because like you said, when you overstate things, you start to create these unintentional divisions. Like you were talking about how people come to you and they say, so what you're saying is, and like you, I also want to stab myself in the throat and just watch the blood come out of me until I pass out when people say that to me, because indeed what I said was what I said. But I do that too, so I can't be too mad. Like we all do it. It's part of being human. And one thing I can say to the listener, when you find yourself typing, so what are you? Hit delete a few times and type in, so what I'm hearing is, and this is actually a key aspect of just healthy communication, is owning the fact that you're interpreting what they're saying. Because you're not putting the blame on them. They obviously tried to say what they meant to say, and you're doing your best to interpret it. You may have interpreted it wrong, and that's okay, but you're much more likely to trigger someone if you allow your triggeredness to then put the blame on them for what they're saying. So own the shit. Own that you're hearing they're attacking, protein timing, or they're attacking your intermittent fasting protocol that got you in great shape, that's been able to allow you to stay lean, and then to have a discussion with them. And they, myself, Danny, all of us are much less likely to be annoyed and to give you a much more engaged discussion. I can say that from experience.
Yeah, I think generally a good rule is when you are going to ask someone about that, particularly if it's something that seems opposed to what you either currently believe or what even you feel is actually correct, is to still represent what they've said in the most charitable terms you can, as opposed to the classic like straw manning of making it the worst interpretation of what they could have said, right? So I think it just generally it also makes your argument a bit more robust, to be able to give someone that in the most charitable terms. And I think just as you were saying that, it kind of reminded me that when we're having these types of conversations, not only should we try and allow someone or represent someone else's ideas in the kind of most charitable way, or steel man them whatever way we want. I do think that what was this? No, I don't know what I was going to say.
Don't worry. You said steel man. I have a proposal, and I've heard that before. When we're talking about the fitness industry, we should swole man everyone. Just assume they're at their most jacked, most swole in their intentions, rather than straw manning them.
Yes, yeah, I would second that. Yeah, that was a great save.
Yeah, but what you build up to that you then petered out and lost your manhood to finish there was
brain fog is kicking in.
It happens, hanging with us. I know it's late there for you as well, but yeah, it's a really good point that you made of. When you hear something, try to create, this is what steel manning is for those who haven't listened to our previous episodes where we've talked about it, try to create the most charitable version of what they said. And that principle of charity is so important because then it shows that you're actively trying to get to the truth rather than trying to win an argument. And that is where science is misused, is when you are trying to be the smartest guy in the room with science, or the smartest gal with science. That is actually philosophically counter to the goal of the scientific method of trying to hunt down the observations and figure out the most truest interpretation that we can. So anyway, that's just a really good point, even if you had trouble articulating it. Thank you, Danny.
I will think of what I was going to say, because it was actually a lot better than that.
Oh, you got it now. You're ready?
No, I don't have it. I said I will remember. I need you to kind of keep just talking nonsense for maybe another 10 minutes. And
that's basically this whole podcast. No, I'm here to talk some more nonsense. A couple other like we mentioned before, you burned a ton of sacred cows on this pathway of telling us about chrononutrition. I think one of the ones, and this is almost a theme I see in health-based nutrition, and in performance-based nutrition, especially for bodybuilding and strength sport, is that a lot of the health issues we run into today in the modern world for the general population are due to overnutrition, right? The state of us being less and less and less active, less and less able to deal with nutrients that are coming into our bodies. You mentioned hyperlipidemia or hyperglycemia. That's just the food you eat sitting around in your blood because it ain't got nowhere to go. Because you're insulin resistant, you're not expending calories, and that this causes issues. We get arterial buildup of plaque, we get damage to our cells from high glucose levels, and heart disease, metabolic disease, all these things, and the stress on our body from being obese, and then the even greater stress on obese and sedentary, and we're not even getting higher bone mineral density or building muscle. All of this comes from eating a lot and moving less. I know that's a vast oversimplification, but we're dealing with issues of overnutrition. So a lot of the nutritional interventions for health have to do with finding ways around that and either disposing of all these nutrients in our blood or reducing our total energy intake or changing our behavior such that we're able to handle that greater calorie load and reduce it, kind of on both sides of the equation. So when we see, as bodybuilders, when we read these nutrition study outcomes showing that these patterns of reducing protein intake, sometimes reducing IGF-1 and maybe being related to cancer, and we lose our minds because we think we're eating a high protein diet, or we hear we don't want to be eating close to bedtime, but we're always having our casein shake before bed. Or when we read something about having a time restricted window, but we hear every 3 to 4 hours we can resynthesize mTOR. All these things, when they run counter to each other, I think we have to remember that the trade-offs there are much different when we're dealing with bodybuilders versus the general population. The general population is not at all worried about trying to get an unnecessary level of skeletal muscle mass. And if they were, they wouldn't be having those problems in the first place because, again, the power of resistance training. And they're doing so many things nutritionally that are problematic. So, again, I just want to bring that point home. Like, for example, we were talking about late night eating causing metabolic disturbances, higher glucose excursions, and there's actually data showing it can degrade sleep quality. But all that data is actually in general population, non-exercising people, and it's almost exclusively related to primarily high fat and to some degree high carb meals, but primarily high fat, high calorie meals. Having 40 grams of Greek yogurt from protein before you go to bed, we're talking about 160, 200 calories before bed. A, that's nothing. And B, it's protein. So it's not going to cause those same issues. So maybe don't stress that as much. And I'm not going to say you can have your entire cake and eat it too as a bodybuilder who wants to be healthy. But just know that you're doing so many things that are not part of the inclusion criteria for these other studies on health in the general population that it probably doesn't matter. And you have that kind of robustness that I discussed earlier. So like, for example, I'm still going to have my skier before I go to bed at 9 or 10 p.m. because A, it's only 175 calories or whatever. And B, I'm training. I sleep well. I do all these things. I'm not overweight. I'm not overeating in general. And when I do overeat, it's probably going towards replenishing glycogen, burning calories in the gym, or hopefully building muscle mass. So it's just a minor point I wanted to bring up.
Yeah. I think there's two aspects that I typically talk about this when we get into like the health consideration versus others. And one is people worry about like, how much is this going to impact me? And so as I think you've outlined, what we're really getting at is that for any negative health outcome, there's not one thing that you would do that we can say this guarantees that this is going to occur down the line. What we're really looking at is a risk equation for all these various things. And there's this all these different factors that you can do that are going to be present over many years of your life. And each of those factors will impact this equation. And so it's like numbers in a big massive equation that we would see somewhere. And they're going to just change that risk profile slightly. Now, there's some things that will have a much larger impact on that than others, depending on your context. So even if we say to you, Eric, yeah, you're having something right before bed, but really how much is that going to nudge the needle compared to all the other stuff you're doing if you have 200 grams of basically pure protein? Virtually nothing, right? And then even beyond that, there's some things that we do every single day that may have a slight net negative, but are actually worth doing because we can outweigh them with all our other behaviors related to life. And we make choices all the time that are beyond physiologically what's most healthy. And we can still be healthy people. And this is what people miss when they talk about, oh, this looks like increases risk of X. But I do that all the time and don't see a negative. It's like, yeah, that's just the way it is. It's just increasing a probability, but you can also do lots of things that outweigh that. And I think sometimes we miss that piece, and people maybe unnecessarily worry that, oh, this one thing showed a negative impact on a certain risk, but it may not matter for that given individual, depending on who they are.
Minor correction, Danny. Eric actually said 175 grams, not 200. I do understand that,
I said 175 calories.
Or calories.
You're both wrong.
Wow.
Come
well,
on.
I wanted to say, I
40
thought
grams of protein times 4, 160. Trace carbohydrates because it's Greek yogurt. Guys, come on.
What I was going to say is I love how Eric's point turned from a general point into a tangent justifying why he eats skyr like late at night. Like it started with a very general, here's what you guys should do, to like basically, look, I'm not going to stop eating yogurt late at night. Science be damned is what I think.
He's this dude we were talking about, Omar. This guy is just getting defensive. He won't listen to anything I'm saying. I'm trying to save his long-term health by telling him, don't eat that, man.
So what you're saying is that I'm a bad person for eating Greek yogurt at night. That's what I heard.
Well, we knew that before the Greek yogurt revelation. That was already
so a bad
determined.
person, I eat Greek yogurt at night.
It is an interesting conversation where I bring up before kind of outcome-based decision making. We talk about what's the magnitude of effect of what we're talking about here, and I actually to circle back to the origin, to the tonic, if we're talking music, of this discussion in defense of some of the practitioners where they try and distill some of this information. It's like, okay, well, we have to try and give some advice. There might have someone that has a triangle, the Lennon limit. There might be a pyramid, right, where we're talking about things and we're trying to help people conceptualize what's most important. And I think some of the potential danger, and at least what I personally feel with quote unquote the guruism, is in an attempt to stand out, they overemphasize certain points, and so they'll grossly misstate the magnitude of effect of certain things. So it's not that there's not an effect. At that time, we might not know if there is or isn't, but if it comes later on, like let's say with chrononutrition, they have grossly overstated it. So in a way to frame it, and unfortunately with individuals, because we all care here, we all lift, okay? We all like to get swole. When we talk about some of our potential neurotic tendencies, I say neurotic, some people say dedicated, where we're trying to frame things in our mind. It's like, well, wait a second, as you said, Eric, like eating that yogurt, it's like, is there any negative, like in actual practical terms, is there anything negative? Is there something neutral? Could there be something neutral positive? Mayhaps. It's like, so how are we framing these things in our head? And so I think sometimes simplifications can be helpful, but not to the point where we're negating the context.
Yeah, everything is a trade-off, particularly with nutrition decisions. Like literally everything you do is some sort of trade-off, and you just got to assess it based on what you know of what realistically matters to you, and if that trade-off is worth it. And in some cases, it's probably going to be a net positive, net negative, and it's up to you to work it out. So like in Eric's case, there's almost very, like even if there was a theoretical downside, it's probably going to be vastly outweighed by the positive he's going to get from doing that, given his training and lifestyle, and et cetera, et cetera. So everything is a trade-off, and you got to weigh it up like that. And then you also touched on communicating some of this. And I think this is where the importance of not overstating things and extrapolating them out to say that you know everything for sure, because then when something comes out to show that it's actually not accurate, you've nowhere to walk back to, right? Instead of if I say, hey, here's some stuff that we're seeing within the literature on chrononutrition that suggests X, Y, and Z might be helpful, or at least in these studies, there was some sort of benefit for metabolic health by doing these things. Maybe it's worth trying. And then certain people who you're working with, like let's say, maybe are insulin resistant, or maybe don't track macros or so on, and you can start using some of this stuff. Now we come out with some studies and say, hey, do you know what? A lot of these things that we hypothesize might be playing out, the effect isn't actually that large. Now you can say, look, it's not as big as I thought it was. That's cool. If you've built your whole reputation or brand around saying this is the one protocol that you should use and it's going to do all these great things for your health, now you're just going to basically look like a fool. So I think that's the important thing of not overstating some of that stuff. And that was the point that I'd forgotten about 10 minutes ago.
We brought it back. Look,
And we never doubted it.
yeah. It's been said, Danny, that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. But I prefer to think in the fitness industry that extraordinary claims are just fucking cool. Like just go ahead. Just go ahead. That's the rule that we have here.
May the most extraordinary win.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, that is kind of the default. Like you will, like we when we brought Greg and Jeff on, we were talking about walking the fine line with clickbait. That people have become so preconditioned for extraordinary claims that if your title isn't catchy, like if you don't say the best or here's how or everything changed, you can't get people in to tell them the truth. And I think we probably want to get away from that clickbait, but we have to actually change the culture first before we can get the views to make that change. It's this ultimate catch-22. And I think some of that is the way that science is marketed. And I think some of that is, or rather, science used as marketing. Like we were talking about, people try to use it as the one true answer, and it becomes this inversion of what science really should be. But some of that is also the way that we communicate science, and we give it this kind of black and white truth. So it doesn't surprise me when people come to me and they go, "Hey, you posted this study about how," or "I read this study about how plant-based proteins provide a lower risk than meat," but I know that's bullshit because like I eat meat and I haven't died of cancer, and I'm like, that's not, they don't say that exactly,
right?
But the same person wouldn't say, I think this whole speeding being dangerous thing is BS because I'm alive and I drove 10 over. They laugh at that. That's a joke in this conversation, but the previous one is really close to some of the stuff I actually hear. Yeah. And it's because the expectation they have from science is to provide them these huge results, these extraordinary things that we've made claims with, and provide the one true answer that's true in all cases.
Right.
I think it goes. Yeah. Go. And one last thing before I let you talk. I think it goes back to that question you got on your podcast that we talked about. How was it physicalism versus
phenomenological based approaches or phenomenology?
Yeah. Yeah, in my head, I've had that same exact discussion, and I think I framed it as a reductionist quantitative approach versus acknowledging some of the qualitative elements, and I think that's going to be field specific, right? So in nutrition, it's not the same as training. Training is 100% optional. You can go to the gym, you cordon off this 1 hour, and if you want to be that input-output machine, if you want to just do what you think is optimal, you can do that. You might get a hip injury or something like that because you didn't respect your own physiology, or you took too black and white of a view. But you truly can't do that, at least at the population level with nutrition. And the individuals who do it as athletes have knock-on negative effects later because nutrition is part of culture. Nutrition is how we bond, and it's literally how we stay alive. So it's ritualized, and it's so embedded. So anyway, my main point was just that often we have expectations from science that lead us towards these seemingly obvious errors, but they're kind of baked into the way we look at science sometimes. But anyway, go ahead.
No, it's just as you were talking about your conversation with Jeff and Greg and how sometimes there's this need to package things up within certain layers of what people want, and a lot of that can be excitement or novelty or something a bit different that people feel they're learning that they didn't know, or some sort of secret that leads to this. And it's kind of funny because that was essentially why the chrononutrition stuff ended up being something that I started putting out, because if we really wanted to be like conservative and wait until all the data was in to a point where, hey, I'm really certain about all these things, we know exactly why they are working, and I could have waited for like a couple of years, but now it's starting to be there's starting to be interesting stuff come up. But it was really just this Trojan horse to get into the conversation of what we've done today, of saying, hey, there's these times where we're being oversimplistic with these certain narratives that we believe to be true, this nothing matters approach that we can sometimes believe. And here's an example of where that's not necessarily the case. But now if I had gone to a conference and said, hey, I want to tell everyone about how you're being oversimplistic with some of these ideas in evidence-based sound bites, like that doesn't really sound good, right? It's like no one wants to hear that. But it's like chrononutrition gets people excited, and it's something, again, that exciting label that you can use as a point to explain something else. So it just kind of mirrored some of what you said.
Danny, you're
Well, the Trojan horse worked. You're
back
in. We've let a shield killer inside the podcast again to kill us in our sleep.
Now-
The one thing you promised you would never do.
Now,
you
interesting
said
note.
he'll never be back.
Yeah, interesting note. You're not actually at Eric's house this time, and that's just logistics. That wasn't at all any fear on our end. It was more just simple practicality of us wanting to do this podcast and you being 6,000 miles away from Eric. But I will, yeah.
I'm actually in
only
an
moved
Airbnb
3
right
times.
across the road.
Well, from my old residence, what you don't know is this is actually a cardboard cutout with all of my degrees on it that I move around every day. I live on the street now in fear of you. So.
Always moving. Your NEAT is through the roof. I must say that, Danny, you're in the crew, though, because what you said, I don't think you're intellectually dishonest with anything that you do, where we all, they're trade-offs. And that's one of the fallacies, is assuming that something is always a pure positive where there's no negative consequences. Like every piece of content that we put out, everything that you do, whether we're aware of it or not, there's marketing, there's an interpretation of other people, and we have to be aware of that. You are part of the crew, though, where, as I said at the start of this episode, we fight, Eric and myself, against nihilism, the encroaching darkness, the age of decadence. That's what we're about. That's one of the through threads that we do, myself and Captain America. The second one is in a very subtle way, a slightly subversive critique of capitalism that first started with Krieger, saying that obesity is a consequence of capitalism. I was like, whoa, bro, I don't know if I'd be saying that. But we wrap it in a rhetoric where we said in this episode, triggering, snowflake. So people, it's like, we're subverting, we're like reaching them right where they don't know. Like they're agreeing. It's kind of, I'll use a funny analogy real quick. It's like Final Fantasy VII is a video game for those that play video games where a lot of individuals enjoy, but it's actually a critique of a lot of power structures where you essentially play as terrorists that are trying to overthrow the dominant government. And people are like, oh, like that game's amazing and this and that. I'm like, are you listening to some of the ideas that they're actually talking about? That's our culture. So you're part of the crew, bro. Yeah.
So
I'm
welcome
glad
to our
to be part-
libertarian communist podcast.
Yeah.
Which one are we?
Yeah.
We don't even know.
Yeah.
So
We keep ourselves guessing and we keep you guessing.
But that's not for you to decide. It's what the people decide. Whatever label they put on you, that's what it is. So I'm glad to be part of it
if we
now.
can trust the masses, but then again, power corrupts absolutely.
Yep.
Yeah.
If there's one thing we need more of is conversations about politics and religion in a way, because no one will ever have anything controversial to say about those or disagree in any way. So it's much easier than fitness-based discussions.
Eric and myself,
I would agree.
Eric and myself are in agreement that we both should be co-rulers in oligarchy. So like we're not in disagreement about anything. Like in fact, that's what unites us is our politics.
Yep. We need to be representatives of the people by being, elected by them and then into these lifelong roles.
Yeah.
That wasn't really an election. It was actually just that we were ascended by a dark power that will not be named.
Yeah.
But,
It's all very above the board, what we just said. Everyone can get behind it.
Yeah.
Or not.
That
it's
sounds
solidly
pretty standard,
above
yeah.
the ninth circle of hell, like right around the eighth. So, yeah.
Now, Danny, at this time, my man, I will open the floor up to you. Not to commit acts of atrocities, but to just circle back to anything that you
Not a
might
license
want
to kill.
that you might want to talk about. Here that we had a far-ranging, and I knew because again, you on the YouTube channel, man, like I said, you actually made me, and I'm going to give you the compliment that you deserve, that when I did that longer form interview with you, you made me believe, I'm like, man, he did a really good job. I'm like, if I could get other people to talk with this much clarity about, next level topics, I think this could almost be a series. And so you gave me the way, because I've had, in the past, we all had, you do either episodes or this and that. You're like, oh, I think people are going to be bored of this. So I thought you did a fantastic job. And this conversation went anywhere and everywhere. But now it is, unfortunately, the time where we reach the closing song. Is there anything you want to circle back to and talk about? Clarified.
I'm sure there's lots of things that I probably, if I listened back, I kind of probably misspoke or were not very well said or were kind of a bit of a ramble. So apologies first to everyone who watched or listened to those. But hopefully it gave them enough of an interest that they want to go and look at some of the stuff in this area. I'm happy to send you guys links to any particular good review papers or so on, that if you want to link up to that for people that are interested. So probably just more thank anyone who's stuck around this long into the conversation, because yeah, that's great that you've managed to do that, considering that I've been speaking for a considerable proportion of that, and hopefully some of it was useful. So that's as much as I can think of, but I'm happy to take any questions that people might have as a follow-up as well. And also thank you guys for asking me back on and trusting me to say stuff to your lovely audience, given the kind of platform you have. So I appreciate you doing that. It means a lot, and that's it.
Well, you've been a fantastic guest, my friend. I think people have hopefully learned a lot, both on the philosophical side and on specifically chrononutrition. That Trojan horse was not only a good gift, but we also entered and talked about philosophy. So that was good. So where can people find you, Danny?
The best place is probably just sigmanutrition.com, SIGMA nutrition.com. If they like podcasts, Sigma Nutrition Radio is on any podcast app as well as Spotify. And then on the Instagram, I'm Danny Lennon _Sigma.
Awesome. Well, thank you again for being on. And Omar, I'm going to let you take us into the sunset.
Take us into the darkness. I just want to say that everyone should check you out. Those that have made it to the end, do yourself a favor. We have it in the show notes to check out Danny Lennon himself, his Instagram, his website, as well as his podcast, where you could learn all more about this. That made no sense, but we'll just roll with it. I'll catch everyone every single Monday. You can leave a rating review on the iTunes. It helps us out. We are doing battle, Danny. Every week, it was first Sex with Emily. Now it's Exploring Samantha. There are these podcasts that we're waging battle with, an eternal war. And we know we will emerge victorious. We'll be ascended, as myself and Eric know. But you can leave a rating review on YouTube if you leave a comment. We'll do our best to respond, and we'll catch everyone every single Monday. Iron Culture.